Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. Um, Dr. Alicia, you came in as a guest. You should come in as a panelist. You have a unique link. Otherwise, you won't be on camera, my friend. And we'll get started in just a moment. If you could let us know where you're joining from, and we'll get started. We're excited to introduce you if you've not met Dr. Bonaparte and her amazing work. We'll drop a link to her book if you've not purchased it yet. And we'll get started in just a second. Wonderful. The gang's all here. Hello, Dr. Alicia. So good to see you.
It's
Let
nice
me
to see
unmute myself so you can hear me.
you.
Hello,
Thank you.
everyone. Hello, Dr. A. So good to see you. We are excited to talk about your book. Were your ears burning earlier?
A little bit.
We were talking to Dr. Karen Scott, and she was saying how much your book influenced her approach to medical care. So you should have had like the little burning ears. For those that don't know, my name is Marie Boone Clark, and I'm co-founder of Birthing the Magic Collaborative. I'm also a Nana, so sometimes I do look at things through that lens. I hope you all will forgive me for that. But that was through that lens, or based on my experience as um, Nana, that I fell in love with Dr. Alicia Bonaparte and her work and her book and the amazing things that she's done. So I'm going to dive in because I know some of you may be on your lunch hours. So I have the privilege of being joined by Dr. Alicia Bonaparte, who is a medical sociologist. She's a scholar, author, and her work sits at the intersection of race, gender, reproduction, and justice. She is co-editor of the book Birthing Justice: Black Women, Pregnancy, and Childbirth, which is a deeply moving, I believe, and an equally important anthology that brings together scholarship as well as storytelling, in a movement that examines Black pregnancy and childbirth through the lens of justice, dignity, as many of us heard from Dr. Scott this morning, and self-determination. I know that I have not done the book justice, Dr. A, nor have I done your work justice. So before we dive into the reading, correct me or add me. I invite you to add to this introduction. And if not, I know you wanted to start with the forward, and we could start there.
Okay. I mean, I think we should just dive in. I'm totally fine with that. So, again, thank you all for those of you who are here. And for those of you who will see the recording a little bit later on, I thank you so much for just your time and compassionate grace and listening to the things we have to say. So, when we decided to do the second edition, I was asked to write the foreword again. So, this is where I'm going to begin. So, my grandmother, her name is Fiella Coleman. She was the mother of 9 children and 2 stillborns, and all of them were delivered with Black midwives in rural Mississippi. The births of each of my aunts, uncles, and my mother actually happened at home, due not only to the socio-political climate of the time, but also due to the poverty of sharecropping. And yet, these birthing experiences showcased how the overlapping vulnerabilities of being poor, Black, and a woman did not prevent an inclusive, supportive, and collaborative at home birth. Really learning about my grandmother's birthing experience are the reasons why I got into this work to begin with. I want to make sure that I make a point of saying how grateful we are for people pushing us to do a second edition. And in particular, one of the things that we notice is that since its initial publication, Birthing Justice has reached a diverse audience. And in particular, this includes people who are birthing folks, the general public, academics, and practitioners. It's inspired new doulas and midwives of color, and it's become a key text that's used within private and public healthcare and educational sectors. Again, extreme gratitude for this. What's also intriguing to note for us, and this is what I commented in the forward, is that readers consistently shared with us that this work not only served as a guide for their praxis and institution and inspiration, for traditional adherences, but also as a reminder of the continued commitment to righting the wrongs committed by practitioners, policymakers, and proponents of interlocking axes of oppression. Sadly, we still know that the need for and the fight for birth justice persist. Racial and economic justice continue to be thwarted, unfortunately, on local, state, as well as national levels, and innumerable laws and policies, and some of those are even still in the works right now in the hopper, have been passed in the intervening years that further disadvantage vulnerable communities and uplift heteropatriarchy and misogyny. We knew when we created the first edition that it was a roll call of sorts. And in particular, we saw it as a way of calling out to then call people in.
Mm. Thank you so much for starting us in. And I skipped a step. I had told the group this morning that I learned from Shawnee Gibson the importance of stopping and taking a breath. But I was so excited to talk to you. I forgot that step. So you all forgive me. I had committed to doing it and I didn't do it. Um, but you have set the intention for us that you so powerfully articulated that the impetus or the intention behind birthing justice was not just as a scholarly body of work, but a call and almost a call and response is what I guess I hear. And I certainly understand the importance of it being a kind of roll call or a way of calling in. Um, when you think about this second edition, and you address a number of very contemporary topics in the second edition, what feels different to you in terms of who is being called in now, versus perhaps your first edition?
I truly appreciate the question, largely because I think it's a continuation of a calling in, right? So, for example, if you are a person who says, I want to support Black birthing people, then continue to do it, right? Or actually just do those things. And if you're already doing it, this is the part for me where I feel like it's a celebration. The book truly is a celebration of the work that you're doing. And it's also a serving of an encouragement to keep going because we got us, right? We're also highlighting that Black women and femmes are using and have been continuing to use their voices in the midst of really navigating the medical industrial complex, right? It's why, for example, we have a section of the book in which it's dedicated to birth workers who were champions for Black birthing folks, as well as Black women and femmes who were pregnant during the worst parts of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's also
Mhm.
interesting here is that their work and their labors were oftentimes somewhat invisible, or the news cycle just didn't even deem that it was worthy of being discussed. And then, additionally, when I think about what's being asked of us, again, I want to go back and touch on the fact that there's a body of people who are here with us now. There are those of us who will see the recording, and then there's also people even beyond these spaces. And I think a huge part of it, the ask, is to know that you are seen and you are heard and you are loved in these spaces, right? So if you are a Black birthing person who is straight or queer, non binary, trans, or any other minoritized identity, if you suffered pregnancy loss, if you're choosing to not have children anymore or never, and if you're a Black birth worker or someone who supports Black birth workers, know that you are deserving of respect, dignity, honor, and even most importantly, is support. And I say this because, as we noted in the book, we saw some persisting things, right? And in particular, these very prominent tropes. So on page 18 of the second edition, we begin by talking about medical literature. And in particular, we see that medical literature, media, and public policy debates, within all of these things, Black women are often represented as pregnant bodies to be policed, carriers of at risk infants, or recipients of public health education. These representations suggest that our disproportionate risk for pregnancy complications and maternal and infant deaths are a result of, quote, irresponsible choices or unhealthy cultural behaviors. And yet, I also push back, and we note in the book as well, and this is coming from my co-editor, Julia Chinwe Opare, as active agents of our own lives, Black women resist these depictions.
You're so right. The tropes, the stereotypes, and quite honestly, Doctor A, I don't know if I've ever shared with you, that's what was my awakening. I had spent many years playing a doctor on as
Mm,
I had the chance to work for a large pharma company and spent a lot of time in some major hospitals. And I would have argued that I knew everything there was to know about
mhm.
healthcare and particularly maternal health until I met an MFM that was brought into Texas to address their maternal mortality rates. This was some time ago among Latinx women. And as the Dr. Whitty was her name, and as Dr. Whitty was doing her work, I we became friends. And in listening to her, sitting at her feet and listening to her, it was like, wait a minute. Black women were dying at a higher rate, but it wasn't even a topic of conversation. It wasn't a hot media story. And then, yes, it always had that little caveat of Black women don't have access to prenatal care, or Black women don't, or Black women don't. And quite honestly, for me, it was not until Dr. Shalon Irving passed. And it was like, wait a minute, her mama went to Dartmouth. She had double PhDs. She had all the things, right? And now it's starting to look more like my daughter, who I would have thought up until that point was perfectly safe because she had the advanced degrees and the husband but now we certainly recognize that um, that actually puts you at greater risk in many instances, right? And so one of the things that really sort of resonated with me is um, how through not only were Black patients misrepresented, but
Mhm.
then also how granny midwives were portrayed through these tropes of them supposedly not having the skills or that they were perpetuating ignorance. Or would you speak to that?
Sure. So I wanted to just say, just really quickly, I appreciate not only the work that you said that you were able to do and the awareness that it brought to you, but also that you started to become an active agent. And I think I want to just remind people really gently that if you are resisting what's happening in these spaces, you're pushing back against these types of tropes. One of the first ways to always think about is to use somatics, right? So, in essence, take a deep breath, maybe take even some more as you were illuminating a little bit earlier, right? And then also, what this means then is that you have the ability to know your rights and advocate for those things, because that's truly paramount. One of the things I wanted to mention really quickly is that there is a thing that's noted as the Birthing Bill of Rights, which any of you is available to find. It's located on the web. The National Association to Advance Black Birth. On their website, they also have a full listing of what's known as Black birthing rights. And in addition to that, you can also go to the University of North Carolina's School of Public Health website, and you can locate a more generalized Birthing People's Bill of Rights. You should print it out, you should laminate it, and if possible, even bring people with you if you are in a birthing state to make sure that there's extra copies, right? So this again highlights the need for community. And I'm leading with this because you're asking me to talk about granny midwives, and this is what they did. They talked about the way in which community is so vital and important, not only for Black survival, but also for Black thriving. And so, what I'd like to start by doing is sharing a little piece of my chapter. It's called Regulating Childbirth, Physicians, and Granny Midwives in South Carolina, and talking about how this notion of pushing back, using somatics, using the breath, and how they did this within their communities. So, what I noted is that within the South, particularly the Deep South, not only during slavery, but also post emancipation, right? And also, when we want to think about this even more explicitly, you found that countless generations of poor rural women, both white and Black, were attended to by Black granny midwives. Most of these were Black women who had been handed down these lovely tools through a matrilineal tradition. What's also interesting, and I want to make for sure I make it really clear to those people who may not be familiar with them, is that granny midwifery is a type of lay midwifery, and it derives from the term grandmother midwife because many of these midwives tended to be considerably older. Some of them were either menopausal or postmenopausal, and they were vital community members. So, for example, one of the things that they would do is that they served not only in religious positions, but they also were some of the main birth attendants for both Black and white people. So when we think about the work of these people, right, this is where I also push forward this notion that there's a legacy of Black women midwives even today. So there's a group of midwives that I love and I herald them every time I do my work. And that includes people like Dr. Michelle Drew of Ubuntu Health, Jenny Joseph of Common Sense Midwifery, and then also thinking about Jamara Amani, who's of the Southern Birth Justice Network. So when I think about this legacy that these women brought forward, I also think that it's really important to think about how their practices were almost literally eradicated in some interesting ways. Some other things that I wanted to highlight really quickly in thinking about these women is that we know that slaveholding societies largely valued them not only for their diasporic healing traditions, but also the remedies that they offered. Their earliest role was to actually maintain what some scholars call a healthy labor force on southern plantations. And this is more particularly because I focus on South Carolina on rice plantations. As I
Mm.
mentioned before, they tended to serve both Black and white folks in regards to bringing their children into the world. But in addition to that, I always think it's important to note that these women were also slave abolitionists as well, right? Many of them would transport rebellion messages from plantations to other plantations. And last but not least, they also had a large amount of respect by both white and Black communities.
I'm sorry if you see me looking down. I'm writing notes.
No, no, it's totally
Um,
okay, right?
and 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 so it's interesting to me that when you make this connection, that in today's world,
Mhm,
um, how deeply ingrained the vilification of granny midwives or midwives as a whole, right?
mhm, mhm,
Um, so it wasn't just a shift in how care was delivered. It sounds as if, and I know the cheat sheet because I read the book, but for our audience, a
mhm,
targeted campaign to replace the legacy of community wisdom and I'd forgotten the part about them being abolitionists and how they were able to carry communications between the various plantations. When we look at those tropes,
mhm,
that the tropes that were used to describe these women, and we see even today the disdain that some hold for our community model of care. Um, how would you say that we should reclaim our
mhm,
power at birth?
mm. I appreciate your question. Like one of the first things I was thinking about was, within this history, right, we know that it was not just racism, right? This is also fear about economic competition. So this notion of you had a group of doctors that were newly minted and they understood that if I want to get a placeholder in birthing work, it requires delegitimizing this. So when you're talking about this reclamation, I think having this little piece of history is important for people to know. One other piece of history is that these women were responsible for birthing roughly 80% of Black and white babies in the South from the late 19th into the early 20th century. So again, when we notice of like how powerfully they were able to push them out and eradicate them by saying, a variety of different kinds of things, then it's really important to also consider how that legislation is another way in which they push them out. So when we say we want to reclaim these kinds of things, we have to know what the historical precedent is, right? So there's a history of saying, hey, you cannot practice. So when we're trying to reclaim those things, one of the first things that I always think is really important is noting how some of these midwives actually chose to go ahead and be supervised, right, by these doctors. And now we see this legacy in which midwives, like the ones that I had mentioned previously, like Dr. Michelle Drew, Jamara Amani, and then also thinking about, excuse me, the work of Jenny Joseph, what we find is that they're pushing back against the stereotypes that surround midwives. So, for example, many people think that midwives were dirty and officious, and doctors would even make those kinds of comments, right? And so, what we find is if we reshape the way in which people think about midwifery, that's one of the first ways in which we can have a reclamation. In addition to that, though, I also think that beyond just pushing beyond stereotypical myths, we also have to push back for insurance companies. Insurance companies have this unfortunate habit of making determinations of what medical practice should look like. And although, for all intents and purposes, we understand that healthcare is a bureaucratic organization and it's designed to do things hopefully efficiently and so forth, what we also know is that some of the things that midwives are doing today and other Black birth workers like doulas are pushing back against this idea that Black people have higher tolerances for pain, for example, right? Or that Black people are being hysterical and they're lying when they're in a laboring process. And so what then happens then, right, is that midwives and doulas and other birth workers and community members are able to come in and to say, we can look at the legacy of what these women would do. They would stay with a birthing person after they'd given birth for 9 days. And so I know Michelle Drew, for example, Dr. Drew does this. She stays with her patients sometimes, or she has people who she's working with, or apprentices will stay and check in. When we think about the work of Jamara Amani, for example, and her creating and being a founder of a variety of different things that support Black maternal health, then what we also know is these women, these granny midwives, have a legacy of being interlocutors. They, I argue, were one of the first public health advocates for Black people. And again, this is some of the work that Jenny Joseph does in Florida. What's interesting, and I'll say this really quickly, is that she works in a tri-county area. I believe it's Polk, Hardy, and I'm sorry I'm forgetting the other county, but this is a place where there have been high rates, unfortunately, of maternal and infant deaths. And so through her school and through her engagement with community public health work, she's been able to push back and actually make a huge dent in those statistics, particularly for Black women and also for Latinx women as well. So again, when we talk about how granny midwives were pivotal in this way, we see how these three midwives that I'm highlighting, and there are many, many more. So I want to be really clear, everybody, these are just three that I'm highlighting really quickly. We can see how that legacy of being interlocutors, of pushing back against the medical industrial complex, of pushing back against the idea that a safe birth can only happen in a hospital. It allows for us to say that birthing spaces should be by choice, right? And when I say by choice, if you want to be in the hospital, that's great, but supported in the hospital. If you want to be at home, that's great and supported by community. And if you want to be in a birthing center, that's great and wonderful as well. There are a variety of different ways in which we can see this reclamation happen. And then last but not least, there's an imagining, a reimagining of what birth should be and should look like. I apologize. I'm working on office in which we have sustainability features, so the lights will go off if I'm not moving. But in essence, one of the things I wanted to just highlight here really quickly is that when this reclamation happens, this is how we can really make and push the needle beyond Black women and Black birthing people saying, I had these unnecessary birthing complications, I had this unnecessary C-section, and instead there was an adherence to actually being with women, right? And that's actually what the term midwife translates to. It translates to with woman. So it's a praxis, not a practice.
I love that. It's like you shifted the conversation from a history of harm to
Mm-hmm.
what I'm hearing
Yeah.
is one of hope, one
Yes.
of a future of hope. I'm going to name it that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's so beautifully done. We actually had Jenny and her team on last night, and what she's doing is just phenomenal. And the fact that she has created a model that's so easily, maybe that it sounds easy, but that's accessible and replicatable. Um, that and the fact that she was like, oh, you can request our passport. You can. It wasn't as if she was putting price points on things, right?
Right.
Um, we if we could go back,
Sure.
um, and I love that you were outlining how we are pushing back against the tropes that if you could speak candidly about how racism and
Mm-hmm.
bias have impacted our um, lived experience as Black birthing people
Mm-hmm.
from
Mm-hmm.
your research, through your lens, I guess I should say.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, if people don't mind, I'm going to share a couple of quotes
Oh, yes,
from
please.
not only my research, but also just kind of highlighting how doctors not only perceived Black midwives, but also, I would argue, Black people too. So, when we think about the ways in which they said, let's push back and let's try to get rid of these women, there was a doctor, and this is writing in 1910. His name is Alan Freeman, and he says, there is no doubt that tens of thousands of women are being absolutely murdered by ignorant midwives. Everyone who has ever practiced obstetrics knows how filthy and dirty, how officious and meddlesome these women are. And we know what a tremendous total of fatal and crippling illness they cause every year. We must tell the people how many women these midwives are killing and how much illness they are causing. I don't think people want to run the risk of being infected or killed by midwives. They run the risk because they don't know. The obstetrician and the health officers are the only people who apparently do know. Then, if we are going to be true to our duty, we must bring this information to them. A little bit later on, although it's not included in this version of the text, but it's in some of my other published works, I talk about how Dr. Freeman very specifically started talking about Black people, right? And he said that Black people are innately ignorant, they are dirty people, they're incapable of understanding technical knowledge, et cetera, ad nauseum. And so when we think about if this is the way in which doctors were perceiving Black people in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and we consider how these things persisted into today, it then makes sense, right? When we come along and we start thinking about in the same year as Dr. Freeman, that Dr. James A. Haynes was also making some arguments as well about the state of South Carolina. He says, we can see that for South Carolina, to have 10 times as many women to die during paturation and pregnancy means that something is radically wrong with our system. We allow dirty, ignorant women to proclaim themselves capable of taking care of mothers at this time when they should have the most skilled care and attention. There's no midwife law in South Carolina. No one, no matter how ignorant she may be, is debarred from calling herself a midwife. They are neither licensed nor inspected, nor do they know anything in regard to what is necessary to preserve life under these circumstances. So I want to pause for a second because I think I might be reading a little quickly, but I want to note that there's these constant terms of dirty, ignorant, meddlesome, officious, and so forth. These are caricatures that borrow from terms that were used during colonial times to describe Black people, right? And to use a way of creating a racial hierarchy, defining that white folks and white plantation owners in particular are at the top of the top, right? And that Black people remain at the bottom. And so if we know that there are these beliefs about Black people already, then it makes sense why there's a very clear bridge, this idea that Black people are innately able to sustain themselves if they're experiencing large amounts of pain. Again, that's a trope that comes from slavery, this belief that because they didn't make a sound while they were being beaten and other types of heinous things happening to them, that there's nothing happening, when we know that that's a coping mechanism, right? So if I don't show the pain, then perhaps some other type of danger will be lessened for me as a Black person. And then also, I think it's important to consider too, is that there's a history of describing anything that has to do with obstetrics and gynecology for women, that they're hysterical, right? That there's something wrong with women. So when you label, or you combine that, I should say, with also being Black, you've got this double burden of persecution and prosecution, is what I would make an argument for. One other thing that I think is important to consider too, when we think about how clearly these individuals were racist, is that what I found in my own research is that doctors actually would go so far as to actually usurp the knowledge of Black granny midwives and then claim it as their own. So on the one hand, they're saying these horrible things not only about Black people, but also about Black midwifery, but then they also valued the information that they were sharing. So you see this very interesting contradiction of sorts of like, you want to be racist, but you also want to steal the thing that I have as well. And so what we see, something sadly very similar today, right, is that many people who tend to be medical subjects, or the people who are patients within teaching hospitals, tend to be Black people. And so medicine and medical professionals are learning off of the backs of Black people and holding on to and adhering to these same racist tropes from hundreds of years ago.
So much to unpack there. First, I think it's as a lay person, in reading your book and understanding that this was a very strategic, calculated effort to undermine the value of Black midwives, and that it was driven by greed. um, and it was successful.
Yes.
But I think it also reminds us that the crisis we're seeing in maternal health today, the data that we're constantly trying to move the needle on, wasn't by accident. It
No.
was actually a success
Mm-hmm.
for the medical monopoly at the time.
Yes.
And when we hear the way they describe these women, and the way that they systematically pushed out granny midwives, it sort of explains. It doesn't
Right.
excuse, but it explains what we see now.
Mm-hmm.
And what we sat with just an hour or so ago and talking to Dr. Karen Scott, and her reading about the mamas and how they felt dehumanized and their birthing experience. Um, I'm gonna, before I go to my next question, let's see if there's anybody who has a question in the chat. If you guys have questions, please interrupt us. Y'all know I can talk, and I've been stalking Dr. Bonaparte now for almost 2 years. And so no, it has been 2 years. I think it's 2 years this week that she did a beautiful conversation with us. And so I've got a lot of commentary and questions for her, but if you want, please. Um, Going back to the history,
Mm-hmm.
and even with the history that we just discussed, you
Mm-hmm.
also highlighted how, and you touched on it briefly, but I want us to go back to it again, how this legacy persists through
Mm-hmm.
the work of midwives like Michelle Drew, Miss Amani, Jenny Joseph. From your perspective, what does it mean to see that lineage, that it's not just remembered, but is
Mm-hmm.
actively being practiced and evolving today?
Yeah. So the title of my dissertation was about the persecution and prosecution of these midwives, right? And I think when we think about Jenny, when we think about Michelle, when we think about Jamara, what it tells you is that although they tried to eliminate Black midwifery, we're still here, right? These women, these very powerful women, have a legacy that they uphold. I'll speak really briefly about Dr. Michelle Drew. She is the great great granddaughter. I might be missing a great there, of a granny midwife. And today she works as not only as a certified nurse midwife, she's also a family nurse practitioner. She's a home birth midwife. And like me, she's also a historian of Black granny midwives like Sadie Felder P and also Katie Denmark. And then similar to Dr. Drew, Jamar Amani, she's also a practicing midwife. She's the founder and executive director of the Southern Birth Justice Network. She's an architect of the Black midwives model of care, as well as the Birth Justice Bill of Rights. In addition to that, what I love is that she's also the founder of Black Midwives Day, which has become a nationally recognized holiday. So this is a huge thing. This is vitally important. And then last but not least, I think, as you mentioned before, you've already had Jenny Joseph as a part of what you all are doing this week, which is so vital. But I think it's also important to note that she's one of the first Black women who's owned their own midwifery school in the country. And that in and of itself shows the persistence of legacy. I want to highlight really quickly, too, for those readers who may have not had the chance to read the book as of yet, is that Jenny and I actually have a co authored piece in which we tie my research of being a midwife to her own experiences of being a midwife. And it's very much so worthy of a read. The subtitle of that piece is called Becoming an Outsider Within. So we borrow from Patricia Hill Collins' discussion about Black feminist perspectives and sociology and so forth as a way of kind of describing how the work that she's doing in Florida, which is public health outreach, is very, very similar to what Southern Black granny midwives were doing. Because as I said, they were traveling between plantation to plantation, not only as abolitionists, but also providing care. And in many instances, white plantation owners would actually hire them out. So when we think about the fact that Jenny and Michelle and Jamar are all doing public health outreach as a part of the work that they're doing, that in and of itself is the legacy continuing itself. One other thing that I wanted to highlight here too is that Dr. Drew is a big fan of showcasing how and why legacy is important, right? It's a way of going back and bringing in storytelling as a way of saying, hey, let's not forget these people. And I was very excited that all three of these women that I'm just mentioning right now were a part of a conference that I did with my co founder, Dr. Keisha Good, called Midwifery as Public Health, in which, again, not only were we showcasing the importance of Black granny midwives, but also showing how we can continue to reach back and learn more things from what they did to help Black communities and other communities of color today.
Wow. It's funny that you mentioned your dissertation because I do have a question about it. And
Oh,
it links to contemporary day. Because one, you used a word I had to look up and I
mm,
still can't pronounce it. So I'll spell it if I get to it.
sure.
But in your dissertation, you laid out the groundwork, quite honestly, for everything that we're talking about today, right? About the specific language that doctors use in medical journals to prosecute
Mm-hmm.
or persecute granny midwives. You looked at and this is the word I couldn't pronounce, and I want to link it to modern day. We have seen the headlines, I think just even in this week, a group of midwives who have sued the state of Georgia, right, because of
Mm-hmm.
their intense legislative and overreach in terms of requiring midwives to be certified. And you used a word, abrogatation.
Abrogation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. In which so I would love to ask you,
Mm-hmm.
um, you looked at the specific language that doctors were using in medical journals and in the public discourse then. When
Mm-hmm.
we look at the recent events in Georgia and we see where, one, Georgia has some of the highest Black maternal mortality rates in the country, they have medical deserts, right? Um, how do you see the correlation, like with this whole
Mm-hmm.
certification of need laws? And I think that's what the legislation is called, is
Mm-hmm.
sort of certificate of need,
Right.
and how they're restricting licensing to block birth centers and midwives from
Mm-hmm.
operating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, it's calculated, but
Yeah.
we would love your
Yeah.
reaction.
Yeah. First and foremost, I actually grew up in Georgia, so it's interesting that you're using Georgia as the case right now. And although I'm smiling, I'm also saddened, right? Because the hope, of course, is that we don't have to keep talking about historical precedent to talk about what's happening currently today, and yet it's still necessary. So for me, when I think about the notion of delegitimization, right? And that's what I largely focus on in my own work, particularly in the dissertation, and then also some of the continuation of my work. This notion of how do you discredit someone so that you can have greater authority in the field? And doctors were so successful with what they did with Black grading midwives, largely because they had an interdependent relationship with the law, right? With the legal profession. So what they said is, let's create these laws to regulate these women. Let's create these stipulations that we know many of these older women are not going to be able to do. So, for example, going to a midwifery institute as a way of showing that, like, I do know what it is that I'm doing, even though, as I mentioned before, they usurp this knowledge. And so when we think about the fact that there's a necessity for Black midwives, again, today, and other midwives who are practicing in states like Georgia to say, I deserve the right to practice and I am a trained person, again, reminds us of how and why the proliferation of the medicalization of birth, the fact that this idea that birth requires a medical doctor to be present. And I don't want to make it seem as though there are not some instances in which someone who is a medical doctor needs to be present, particularly for people who are like at high risk for birthing complications and things of that sort. But this idea and this understanding that they are the only people that should be the birth attendant is a consistent trope through history. And then the other thing is, I mentioned that there's this relationship between doctors and the legal profession. We now also understand that there's a third part of this triadic relationship, and that is insurance companies. So if doctors are able to push forward with legal professionals, hey, we should regulate in this ways. This is what it should look like in regards for people to be able to practice. Then insurance companies kind of jump onto that as well, and they also say, well, yes, because the law says this, we're going to restrict you in these ways. So it makes full and complete sense in regards to how and why midwives are consistently pushed to the periphery of birthing work. I want to pause for a second, and I really want people to understand that outside of the United States, many people are born via midwives. We're one of the few Western countries that regulates midwives in such a strong way to the point where they are less than a third of the people who are birth attendants in this country. I want to also note, and if you're interested, you can go and you can look at the World Health Organization data, that it's very clear that all these births that are happening in other Western industrialized countries by midwives, you tend to see better maternal and infant health rates, right? So, for example, you see lower infant mortality rates, you see lower maternal mortality rates. That's a good thing, and that's showcasing that midwives actually do good work. But if we have those stereotypes that I had mentioned before of they're dirty, they're officious, they use stereotypical things to birth people, and they're nowhere near as qualified as a birth attendant as a doctor, then it makes sense in regards to why these midwives have a fight ahead of them. I'm, of course, hopeful that the suit goes the way in which they would like for it. But we also have to be really, really clear is that there is a corporatization of medicine that's happening right now. And that corporatization of medicine requires there to be only one person who functions as the major medical authority, and that's doctors.
Oh, I love that. And I've heard, and I don't know, I'd have to go back and see if I can find research that verifies this, but in those countries where I have a bestie that did a lot of work in France. And I recall being at a conference with her, and that there was some conversation around with the use of midwives
Mhm,
for those healthy, low risk births
mhm.
sort of opens the door or the calendar for the OB to see the moms who are at higher risk.
Right.
And so that shared partnership is not just a matter of benefiting the mom who has the healthy birth, but the one who's got complications.
Mhm.
And we know that there are many communities in the US where getting in to see an MFM or getting to see an MFM at all, right? Or so, yeah, it's quite honestly a policy choice. It's not and we're an outlier because, as you
Right.
mentioned, for those nations that use midwives, like France, like the UK, one of my dear friends that I worked with for many years, her daughter had married a Frenchman, and this assumption in our little town was, oh, she's going to come back to the States to have her baby, and she was like, no, have y'all looked at this?
Mhm.
This was many years ago, but
Right.
it was an aha that she was actually in a better condition in rural France than she was in the US. So, um, let's see if anybody has questions before I go to my next one. And you're right, Dr. Les, because you can. My daughter, she saw Dr. Cynthia Giamfi Bannerman, and she had a midwife, and so that dual teamwork was so true. Um, if you guys have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to go to my next question for Doctor. And thank you for sharing that with us. Do you want to read another excerpt? I bet you have another section that you'd love to read.
Sure.
Okay.
So when I was thinking a good bit about legacy and this notion of Sankofa, which is something we haven't had the chance to talk about just yet in our conversation for today. There is this beautiful excerpt that Dr. Michelle drew in her one of the chapters that she wrote for us. And one of the things that I love is that she argues that storytelling is so important when we think about the preservation of legacy. And she makes this argument in which she says, telling the stories of who our predecessors were, where and how they lived and practiced reconnects Black communities to the truth of the rich history of Black Americans' contribution to the growth, health, and welfare of our country. By dispelling the notion that our predecessors were ignorant or dangerous, we give respect to past, present, and future generations of Black midwives that they so richly deserve. There's a number of midwives that she touches on within her chapter, but I want to focus really quickly on two of them. And I think you're going to understand why I was very excited to talk about these two women. So the first is Katie Denmark. She was a community midwife in Winter Haven, Polk County, Florida for 4 decades. So you may recall that I mentioned that Jenny Joseph serves the Polk County in Florida. So again, a nice little bridge there. She was born Katie Adams on December 30th, 1895, the daughter of Grimmel and Ellen Adams in Wassissa, Jefferson County, Florida. She was the granddaughter of a midwife, Eliza Call, who had been born enslaved. She learned the skills of herbalism, root medicine, quilting, and midwifery from her mother and grandmother. So again, we see that continuation of a matrilineal passing on of wisdom and training. The other person that I wanted to highlight really quickly within Dr. Michelle Drew's chapter is she talks about Sadie Felder. Sadie Felder was born on September 20th in 1908 in Jameson, Orangeburg County, South Carolina, the daughter of Herbert and Lavinia Todd. Again, because my research focuses on South Carolina, this is also why I was excited to talk about her. She was the great granddaughter of Emma, a midwife born enslaved, and she served as a plantation midwife while she was enslaved and as a free Black woman. Sadie became interested in midwifery, listening to her grandmother's stories about not only her work, but she also learned herbal remedies from her grandmother and in her home. Now, what's interesting about Sadie Felder McPhee and that she eventually married is that she not only practiced midwifery, but she also went back to school and then became a nurse. And she literally served for 50 years working as a healthcare practitioner in the state of South Carolina. She was involved in a variety of different types of public health efforts. And I highlight her for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that I think it's always important to consider, right, that many of these women were the descendants of people who had been oppressed. Many of these people are descendants of people who, despite that oppression, they still learned how to help Black communities through herbalism, through healing, through being birth attendants. And I just think it's just so vitally important for us to kind of sit in that for a second and to think about our legacy is not just one of survival, but also thriving, and that there have been pivotal people that have been a part of that process. One other thing that I was thinking about in regards to our conversation today, Miss Marie, is I also wanted us to note, right, that birth justice is a movement. And if we think about this type of legacy that Black women midwives kind of laid out for us, we think about people like Sadie, we think about the work of Dr. Michelle Drew, Jenny Joseph, and Jamar Amani today, it makes sense in regards to how and why this movement requires, right, requires not only a recognition of this legacy, but a preservation of this legacy as well.
Oh, so true. And I love the story of Miss McGee to think about for her to serve for 50 years, starting in the I guess early to mid 20th century, if I'm doing my math right,
Mm-hmm.
and navigating that, the complexities, and to survive and thrive. It's just, it's humbling.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so one of the questions I guess I would have from this
Mm-hmm.
is how do we, for the nanas of the world who don't get the
Yes.
joy or don't have the luxury of talking to people like you and
Mm,
Jenny and Karen Scott and Leslie Farrington and all of you that are doing amazing work, how can we expose our
mhm,
community to this powerful history, but
mhm,
then also to the work that you are
mhm.
championing? You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
Sometimes the Southern
champion. I'm
accent
with
will not
you.
work.
I'm with you, Miss Marie. I'm totally with you. So I want to just highlight really quickly that something that January and I, and also Black Women Birthing Justice, decided with our first edition of the book is we actually created like a book club set of questions. And
Mm.
we started suggesting to people have table talks and use the book as kind of like the grounding foci for those table talks. So that would definitely be one way that this can happen. And if you go to the Black Women Birthing Justice BWBJ, if you go to their website, there's that that series of questions is located there. So that's just one way. I think another way is tapping into recognizing that there may be practicing midwives within your own community and finding out, are they involved in public health movements, for example, and supporting them, right? And even if that means so much as just recommending them for someone who is pregnant, that might be one way. A small quick thing that I'll say really quickly is one of my former students, her name is Uloma. She was pregnant. Excuse me, she was pregnant when she came to the Midwifery's Public Health conference. And what was really interesting is that all the midwives kept walking up to her and asking her, "Do you have a midwife? If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us." So, again, just like I said before, acknowledging that. I noticed that someone in the chat was asking about the name of the website. So, I wanted to say it again. It's called Black Women Birthing Justice. And they
Yeah.
are largely responsible for how and why the first edition even happened alongside with Junia Chinyere Opara. So I just wanted to make for sure I said that again and acknowledge that I did see that comment in the chat. So thank you so much also for posting that to the chat for people to be able to go to that. Another thing
And
that yeah,
we'll send it in our email when we
yeah,
send
no worries.
the recording too,
Yeah.
so people can find it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. And I think also I want to just go back and highlight again, right, that when we think about this type of legacy, I'm actually in the process as a byproduct of doing that conference with Dr. Keisha Good, the Midwifery's Public Health, is actually creating a class that's designed to talk about this legacy and that's designed to also herald midwives that are doing wonderful and amazing things right now. I know there's a number of midwives literally right down the street from me, quote unquote, in LA that are doing this kind of work. So, for example, at the Kindred Midwifery Birthing Institute, right? And we know that there's important work that's happening there. I mentioned already Black Women Birthing Justice. I also am thinking about people like Nakia Grayson, who runs a midwifery and a maternal health care center in in Memphis, Tennessee, right? So again, noting that these people are already doing this work, supporting them in whatever way that it can happen, I think this is how we really can change things and can shift things. We can reimagine what birth is supposed to be, right? That it's not something that can only happen within a medical institution, but it can actually happen by choice in the ways in which people want it to happen.
Thank you. I
Mhm.
got sidetracked. I was trying to find the link to because I'm not finding the link to the book club conversation points
Okay.
on the website.
I can
Um,
find that for you and send it to
okay,
you so that you can
and then we'll
refer to
share
the
it.
participants
Okay.
if that would be a little
Um,
bit easier. Yeah, I'm
I,
happy to.
I couldn't multitask fast enough, but I
No, it's
did send
okay.
everyone the link to the site
Mhm.
itself.
Yeah.
And thank you for asking, Tanya. The Black Birthing Bill of Rights are under the same website. That's the link I'd shared earlier.
Mhm.
Um, we are we've got 10 minutes. So wait,
Oh.
we're not done yet. Wait, we're not done yet. I think one of the things that you've talked about well, first I think we let's talk about how storytelling is such a critical
Yeah.
part
Mhm.
of advancing birth justice. We've heard
Mhm.
from Janet Williams, who shared her beautiful transitions journal and the importance
Mhm.
of mamas journaling their own lived
Yeah.
experiences.
Mhm.
We talked about the 36 or so stories that are in Karen Scott's beautifully written book. And then now
Yeah.
we have the stories that you've created.
Mhm.
And then I'll go back and talk about St. Copa. But
No, you're good.
how do you see storytelling not only advancing birth justice among lay people, but
Mhm.
how could it possibly influence research and policy?
Ooh, I like this. So I'm always of the belief, and maybe this is because of my lineage of Southern Black people, but if we don't tell our stories of triumph, survival, and community, then I think this is where research and policy can fall flat, right? So we know that research and policy oftentimes they draw upon data, but you have to understand and recognize that there are people behind these numbers that are used to promote research and policy, right? And so when you start associating the story with the number, that to me is how you can make Blackbird something that's much more salient first and foremost. And it also paints a larger picture of why communal support is necessary to shift the experiences of birthing people, especially minoritized people. I think something else that I wanted to highlight really quickly here too in this conversation about storytelling and so forth is that I think about the West African tradition of being a griot, right? Being a storyteller, the person who is the repository of knowledge for a community, for a village. And so what you find then is that in order for this movement it has to have these stories. These are the stories that move people to action. And so for me, when I think about policy, policy is oftentimes the result of action. And when I also think about birth justice and knowing that it is a movement, that movement requires not only the stories, but then also the action, right? So that we then have praxis, right? We see that praxis comes into existence. One other quick thing that I wanted to note as well in regards to storytelling is a heralding of sorts of thank you so much for being the person that holds that information. I'll just say this really quickly. One of the things that Dr. Michelle Drew did for our conference is that she brought in a whole bunch of implements that had been used by her great grandmother, right, as she was a midwife. And it created a variety of different conversations. And in addition to that, it also helped for those people who are already doing public policy work to then be able to say, is these tools, right, were tools of promoting not only community, but the continuation of a people. And so when we think about how policy is supposed to help people, it's supposed to improve the lives of people, then we see this legacy of grading midwifery preserving the legacy of Black people. And we also can see how research and policy can also mimic that work as well.
Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful point.
Mm.
Um, let's see. There's a question. Oh, I'm with you, Valerie. Let me see. The my A word, Dr. Alicia, ABRO
Abrogation.
ABROGATION.
Yep,
One the
yep,
spelling bee.
abrogation. It just simply means elimination, like a concerted effort to eliminate someone or something. Mhm.
I'm telling you, I looked it up.
No, I like
And
that
I
you
said,
did.
and then I said,
I
I'm
like
going to
that
put it
you
in
got
my
it.
language, but then the Southern accent, when I'm trying to hide the Southern accent and not, I couldn't say it.
No,
Um,
you're good. You're good. You're
Tanya's
good.
question is, what's the best way to become a better storyteller?
Ooh, I mean, I don't know if I'm a good storyteller. I try.
Oh,
Um,
you are.
I think because I've been doing this work for such a long time, I think this is the benefit, right, of hitting my 50th year. I hit it last month, that I think I'm able to cull pieces to explain things, if that makes sense, right? And my students say this sometimes too. They're like, you're really good at like wrapping things together and
Yeah.
connecting things together. And I just know for myself, the things that mean the most to me is I believe how I'm able to tell the story. So seeing that impact, as I was mentioning earlier with Michelle Drew, and her bringing in those implements and we created a beautiful exhibit and seeing how that drove conversations allowed me to then be able to engage in our conversation today. One of the other things is sit at the feet of elders. I think that's one of the best ways you can become a storyteller. You learn from what they do. What's the theme? What's the frame? What's the point that they're getting to? How do they create this denouement type moment, right? Of like the climax of the story. These are the ways in which I think storytelling can be something really beautiful, and not only something really beautiful, but something that's very rich with detail and information that can then be passed on to other people. And the more, I don't want to use the term dramatic, but I think the more impactful of a story that you tell, the
Mm.
better of a storyteller that you are. Mhm.
Oh, I love that.
Mhm.
I'm not a good storyteller. I ramble. My dearest says that his mind gets lost. Before I lose this thought, I am good at ideas though.
Yeah.
I really love that you said you brought that she brought in the implements that were used by her granny midwife, or her grandmother who was a midwife, and that you shared it in that space. I know a lot of communities do baby showers, especially around
Yes.
May, right? For
Yes.
the Mother's
Yes.
Day, and they're
Mhm.
very very targeted to the Black community.
Hmm.
What I would love, and this is a challenge for my friends that are out there, and I'm going to
Okay.
include it in the email. Two things. One is when you have your baby fairs. And it's
Hmm.
not to terrify mamas. I don't think this Dr. A's book or Dr. Karen's book scares them, but I think it's very empowering. One, include these books, buy them, have them on hand, share them, share the little QR code for mama to buy it for herself.
Hmm.
The second is this is a challenge for you, Dr. A, is
Mm.
if you all would consider, obviously not for May this year, but a video where you showed the history of
Ah.
like we could do a whole little short film on maybe someone's already done it, but I've not seen it.
Mhm.
The history of granny midwives and how that is an integral part of our community.
Yeah.
And then as a minister's daughter, my challenge to those pastors is y'all have a little tea party and
Mm.
show this because the church has always been at the forefront of the civil rights movement, and we should be at the forefront of the maternal health reclamation, not
Mhm.
crisis. I'm not going to use that word anymore. I'm saying reclamation.
Yeah.
Um,
So I
last,
wanted, oh,
Valerie, we are not giving nurses CEs for this site so that this session. The next one later today on newborns and newborn testing, that's the one that will offer CEs. But if you are a doula, we will provide a certificate of attendance for doulas. You can't offer CEs if you are specific about the person acquiring something. I won't say buy, but we wanted to very, very openly. I did. The corporate person in me said, I am not going to suppress these women and not let them say, buy their book. And if they don't say it, I'll say it for you.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tanya. She said, congratulations on your 50th. I thought you were in your 30s, girl. You guys are the epitome of Black don't crack. Oh my goodness. I still have shoes older than you, but
So I was going
or
to
as
say
my
really
friend's
quick.
mother, my honorary godmother used to say, she had money older than certain people. And I'm
Mm.
like, money? And she said that meant that by the time you were born, I was making so much money I could save it.
So I
So
wanted
that's how
to,
much older than you I am.
yeah, I
The
wanted to address
IBCLCs,
really
we don't
quickly.
have CEs for IBCLCs, Crystal, but again, we can give you a attendance certificate.
Yeah.
And Valerie says you do look good, very well preserved.
Thank y'all. Y'all are so kind. I
I
did want
bet
to say
it's
really
genetic.
quickly, you were asking about, you were giving a challenge, and I wanted to note that there is a few videos that exist. For those people who are interested, there is a story of Maud Cullen, who was a very famous Black midwife in South Carolina. Time Magazine actually created a whole film about her. In
Oh,
addition to that, when I was in graduate school and was working on my dissertation, there is a film that came out called Calling in the Spirit that also is a history of granny midwives as well. The Maud Cullen piece is not that long. I want to say it's roughly about an hour. I use it sometimes when I teach my class, Moon, called Black Women, Pregnancy, and Ritual in that class. So if people are interested in grabbing some of these things, I promise you they are very much so available. And I know that Dr. Drew used to sometimes from time to time would post videos on her Instagram in which she would showcase stories of Black granny midwives as well. So each of these little tidbits actually are in existence. And in addition to that, Jamar Amani and their partner have been working on a video tracing this legacy throughout the state of
oh,
Florida of Black granny midwives. They did a brief kind of screening of it. It wasn't completed a few years ago. I'm hoping it's getting closer to completion. But again, these projects are in the work. So I just wanted to say really quickly to herald those people who are doing that work
oh,
already,
thank
and it's
you. Yes.
available
And
for you all.
I jotted it down and we'll include a link if we can find it, or at least the
Yeah,
title in
right.
our follow-up email with everyone. And thank you, doctor, because I think this would be a wonderful way. I love the concept of the baby fairs. I love the concept of, giving mamas gifts and diapers and all those wonderful things. But we should
Mhm.
also give them the gift of knowledge, right? And
Mhm.
so we'll share that with those of you who are using it. And then if there isn't one scheduled in your community, let's work on that. Um, Final thoughts, Dr. A.
I appreciate you giving me a moment of reflection. I think one of the first things is I would just love for people honestly to hold deeply in their hearts and in their souls that we as Black people have a legacy not only of survival but thriving. Because I think the way that Black birth is oftentimes talked about is it's equated with death. And I don't like that. I think that Black birth is something that should be considered as something that is not only beautiful, but is also one of the most magical things that we can shepherd and support within our community. And last but not least is that I hope that for those people who are watching today, and maybe those people who are watching the recording a little bit later on, that you realize that you can function as a community health worker. You don't have to go through the certification process in regards to thinking about how can you help your community, right? How can you help your community understand medical leaves, for example? How can you provide these pieces of information I mentioned before, like the Birthing Bill of Rights, the copies of it, the lamination, and things of that sort, right? That's not to say that community health workers don't go through a certification process, but you could be a lay community health worker in this way.
Mhm.
Because again, this is what people have been doing within our community for such a long period of time. And lastly, just support the birth justice movement, right? It's bigger than me. It's bigger than those people who originated the term. This is a huge thing that requires continuation. It requires legacy. It requires intention. And it's my hope that the work that I've contributed to the book and some of the other work that I've done as well inspires people. That's always my hope with my work. And just thank you. Just extreme gratitude to you, Miss Marie, and extreme gratitude to the people who stayed to the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. A. Thank you guys for in the audience. We will send the recording and the link to acquire Doctor's book. And she even gave a discount, and we meant to drop it in the chat, but I forgot to send it to Grace.
Yeah.
We'll drop that. We'll include that for you all to get a meaningful discount for the book. And we will see you guys at 4:30. We're going to talk about the importance of knowing your roots as you go into your pregnancy and preparing the family health history. So talk to you all then. Thank you, Dr. A. Talk to you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.